I'm very grateful to Jim Linville and to Hina and to Steve to very fortuitously provide context to segue to my own curiously context result of many dark nights and afternoons and wee hours of the morning of thinking about what exactly I was going to say about any aspect of Islam as a non-Muslim. However, I will also be riffing in part, at least in this introduction, on a theme Jim brought up, giving the devil his due. I will, come down from the tree and play kind of a playful little snake in the grass in raising directly to some degree and indirectly some issues that are germane precisely for reasons that, again, Professor Linville raised and which Alan Dow raised last night, which is when we are talking about things, it's a damn good idea to actually know something. The devil is always in the details. And so the snake is going to, in a limited way, because we're talking about Islam, and as the t-shirt said, it's more complicated than that. But we will get down a little into the weeds and roll along a kind of stream of conscious that came to me as, I thought, a suitable, little less formal approach to getting people to thinking about Islam and their thinking about Islam. It all came about because I had been looking and searching for something to write on, to not be too stereotypical, but I was hit continuously through the late summer and into the fall, in part in my capacity as an analyst for the Government of Canada, with the sad fact of what we all now know as the green screen atrocity, following on the Charlie Hebdo catastrophe and the Yulin's Post cartoons of 6 years ago. And so the issue arose to me because of some familiarity with the diversity to which Hina referred in the Islamic world, of asking the question, well, what do people know about the face of Islam? And in some measure, of course, the face of Islam, in a curious way, is the face of Muhammad. And you will note here that you don't get to see the face of Muhammad. We'll get to that and some of the reasons later. So, that's the question. What do you, people, popular, know about Islam? They know about the Hajj. They may be aware that there's something in Mecca, and it's important to Muslims. They know precious little, most people, about really not only what that means, but the history, the context for Muslims of things, and why the things they hold sacred are cherished and respected in certain ways. They know about Ramadan and the fast, and to some degree about iftar. They may know a little something about the family and its place in the context of that festival, and how that informs the thinking of many a Muslim. And of course, looking at this, they may be aware of certain prohibitions, dietary prohibitions, the prohibitions on intoxicants. They may not be entirely clear on where they came from. They might just think, oh, it's kind of like Jews, except, Jews get to drink and they have Manischewitz, which is not really worthy as a drink. One plus of being a Muslim is you don't have to deal with Manischewitz. They think a lot in the popular imagination about women in Islam. Muslim women, women who are identifying themselves as Muslims and their practices. Here we have fashion hijab, something that people are unclear on. Once again, they very often will, in order to pursue their own narrative, rhetorically, go to extremes and not take into account factors that Hina has raised, such as the issues of choice, the ranges of choice within certain Islamic communities, within certain traditions, and where that leads. I skipped putting in a couple of nice shots of sport hijab. It's an interesting concept. It's a recent concept that has come up. A development in hijab technology and sportswear technology. I had a couple of good slides of women playing football. Think about this. When we're looking at current events, we have to think very carefully about the role of Islam and whose Islam is at play. Here we have from just a year ago a case of, what's this? Well, it's a woman voting. And evidently she probably has some significant experience, given my estimates of her age, of voting in Egypt in the presidential election, the first round. And she's doing it with what appears to me some considerable enthusiasm. So it is incumbent on us to think, again, in the grass, in the weeds, about the specifics. And as Hina has pointed out earlier on, not just in broad generalities, but to look at local conditions, to look at the context, to look at the latitude individuals have within tradition and culture. And, as Hina has pointed out, the efforts they're making outside of it. And we have, of course, our own prejudices. We have to be very careful about our filters, the context for our own thinking. Again, part of my wrestling over the last couple of weeks was finding a really interesting, relatively short couple of articles, one by Tariq Ramadan, another by one Muhammad Arkun, about whom I'd never heard before, who worked very carefully at deconstructing Western perspectives on Islam and the modes of transmission of our understanding and knowledge, working toward an epistemology of Islam for the outsider, but also familiarizing them with the traditions and with the specific internal context in Islam to facilitate understanding. Yeah, I've spent too long on that slide. We have this. Again, this is something which Hina pointed to. The fact that there are, yes, indeed, as some would say, some who are merely protesting their right to hijab. Why? Because they're being pushed by the men. It's a way of giving them sense of value in the community. On the other hand, they are, in fact, in many instances, true believers. And for them, also, particularly in the Western context, they accept this as their freedom, their very right. When one is engaging in a discourse with them, we have to realize that it's much more nuanced with a lot of individuals and with a lot of groups than we think. And we have someone that many of us like and love, Manal Sharif, engaging in what? Well, something that is, for people in her society, an innovation, which is going out and proving that, in fact, in general, you probably drive better than most of the men on the road in Saudi Arabia. And in all probability, for example, in an Islamic society where women have had the right to drive for quite a long time, Iran, I think the statistics that I've seen show that women are most assuredly better drivers. Okay. So, now we have a big issue, because everything I've presented there is a photographic depiction. What do we understand about legally, okay, theologically, the place of depiction in Islam? Here we have a nice little piece from Pakistan of calligraphy. There's a phenomenon known as hilya, which are pages. They may be various decorative hangings. They may even architecturally be done in ceramic, in which you have the characteristics, for example, of the Prophet Muhammad, which are related verbally and are brought forth when rendering centrally the name of, this is not, of course, a piece of hilya, the Prophet Muhammad, in an ornate calligraphy. And this is, as many people outside of Islam understand it, the only legitimate mode of portrayal of the Prophet. based on descriptions that came from various hadith. For those who know what hadith is, I mean, literally, it's just what things were said by the Prophet Muhammad that fall outside of the actual body of the Qur'an itself, and by others about the Prophet Muhammad and those who were in that small community around him, the Sahaba, the various Ansar from Medina. Again, this is a lot of detail. Well, as I said earlier, it's a lot more complicated than that. And this is where we must tread very carefully. Again, as Jim Linville made clear, we've got to really do our work in order to credibly engage people with questions that are going to be meaningful and possibly lead to something. So, we have this issue. This issue is, okay, here's a nice piece of Hilya. Very often Hilya is not just about Muhammad. For example, you may have the names, this one isn't an example of what I'm describing, of the names of the four rightful Caliph, the Rashidun, around as well. It situates a lot of things historically, which is not always clear to the outsider looking at a piece of Hilya. That in a way, it is a focus on historic context of events and the fundament of Islam. But it isn't necessarily entirely limiting. We also have this, which is very significant in some people's perception. This is the destruction by the Taliban of the Buddhas of Bamyan in 2001. Which was actually the second shot. There was a large amount of defacement done in the late 1990s. Once the Taliban were sufficiently confident in terms of the military position, and I think making an internal point, because Bamyan province is a largely Hazara Shia province, and as we all know, for the Taliban, being Shia may be worse in a lot of ways than being an apostate. And they wanted to make a point about their place of dominance and power. They were going to make a point of piety in destroying the images of idolatry. They were also making a point to the locals. These are the kinds of dynamics we need in dealing with any issue of Islam, to take into account in, again, historic context. Issues, that certainly Hina spoke about when you're talking about the community and their attitudes to others who don't quite fit the mold. Okay, we go on from another nice piece of Hilya. I show a lot of these just because I love the calligraphic work and I love the geometry and the composition of a lot of Islamic art. Again, it's a wonderful thing about it. A lot of people presume that that's just what Islamic art's about. Well, we have this wonderful little piece. This, you wonder, what's happened to the guy's face? This is a typical piece of Shia poster work celebrating, commemorating, and drawing people's attention devotionally to the martyrdom, at Karbala, of the martyr Hussein. This is him in his moments before his ultimate martyrdom. So, hey kids, what's missing in this picture? Well, what's missing in this picture is his face. And that is because that which is sanctified, okay, that which is holy and closest to God, really, certainly for Sunnis, you can never depict it because you are then engaged in something that approaches idolatry and leads you on that slippery slope. Or B, again, for the metaphoric interpretation, and the one that holds more broadly in Islam, you can't depict it simply because you're not doing it justice in that description. Now again, it's a matter of intent with people. And here we have something else that also happens for the Shia at Ashur, which is happening right now. In celebration of, the martyrdom of Hussein and Hassan, people flagellate themselves. They flagellate themselves to basically get into the mindset, so to speak, get into the experience as a devotional act of what those martyrs went through, their devotion to God. And this is pretty minor compared to some of the things you see. And of course we have the various Sunni perspectives on Shia. You know that many Sunni will have no problem about photographing very conservative ones, photographic depiction of those nasty Shia, but try getting them to approve photographic depiction of various honored current and past Sunnis, and graphic depiction. Here's another good example when we think about our understanding of what Islam is and its diversity, and also where it has real impact in the world today. This gang, this bunch of guys, this crew, are actually members of a local Sunni militia in Tripoli, in Lebanon. For those who have been following the news over the last several months, these are people who are involved in the serious knuckle dusting and shootouts with various Alawites. In the city of Tripoli, Alawites, for those who are unfamiliar, are a sort of accepted as weird kind of 11er Imam sect by Shia, just because that facilitates political relations between Iran and Syria. They're, from my perspective, not. They're much more like the Druze and a separate religion altogether. But they certainly are the one sectarian group that has the strongest role in the Syrian Ba'ath Party. And the spillover, again, this is another issue. Islam doesn't know borders too terribly well. The spillover of the Syrian conflict has also been very significant in Lebanon. And each group carries its own understanding of self, its own myths about itself, and myths about others, and many are willing to act on it. And we have what I call the Mutawa'in. It's a bit of a joke. In English, you might spell it the same way you spell Mutawa'in, which is who these guys are. Hina referred earlier to the Wahhabis. Well, the Mutawa'in are roughly the equivalent of some elements in the Basij in Iran. These are the guardians of moral virtue and protectors from vice, who don't do a very good undercover job because they almost always all dress this way. And the way I named them is actually a bit of a pun in Arabic because it refers to two matawas. And you always see them traveling in pairs. That's the other thing. You know you're up against someone who's got an issue with the way you're dressed, your comportment, or maybe wants to smell your breath to see if you've been drinking, because they've always got the same kind of red and white check kufiyah, and they dress in that particularly conservative thobe, and they almost always wear sandals. So yeah, it's like watching the flashing blue and red lights behind you. Right, okay. Now, other important things. How do we understand people regulating their affairs in Islamic societies? Okay, and regulating them in ways that are significant to us in the context of how we think about recent events of the last year and a bit, as well as past history in the Islamic world. Well, we have good examples of one form of a kind of parliamentary democracy. Here we have the People's Assembly in Egypt, which is currently itself going through some reforms, facing constitutional reform, particularly in the context of having, for the first time, an openly Islamist party as the party of government. And we are probably all well aware of what's been happening in Egypt, in Baitan, Tahrir, Damanhur, and other cities in terms of the resistance to certain attempts to hijack or subvert from one group of people's position. In other cases, those more on the side of President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, preserve the gains of the revolution for all from reaction, okay, and deal in pursuit of some sense of justice with what was perceived to be mistaken decision-making by judges in regard to past crimes of various elements in the Mubarak regime. And so you see that in the current tumult in Egypt, you see each side saying that they're actually taking the part of defense of this institution, coming at it from rather radically different perspectives. Here we have the Majlis Ashura. Looks kind of like what we saw before in Egypt, except it's not an elected body. It's in Saudi Arabia. It's a Shura Council. It's an advisory body. It does not have the legislative powers that you would expect to have in a parliamentary body. It doesn't have, for example, the representational basis that we understand. Why? They're all selected. They represent the interests of tribes. They represent the interests of the religious hierarchy. They represent the interests of those who are favored by the royal family as well. And yet they are meant to be there to provide an active institutional voice outside of the traditional modes for the people of Saudi Arabia in dealing with government and the royal family. What they do is they simply take petitions, or they take from discussion, much like we would have in royal commissions, the concerns of people, and seek to formulate suggestions which then will go up through the chain, through the royal family and the various consultants and advisors they have, ultimately to be formulated as legislation. So, in a way, you might argue that it is kind of a weird representational body, but it doesn't work like us. And this is the kind of dynamic we also have to take into account when we are looking at the dynamics of politics and regulation of social life in some Islamic countries and constituencies, and when we're looking at issues of change and the dynamics in which they work. Here we have a diwan. This is much more traditional. This is in the United Arab Emirates. Bless you. Irony of ironies. This is a diwan in which you have princes of the United Arab Emirates. I believe this is in Abu Dhabi, who are meeting a delegation of Saudi businessmen. So they couldn't feel more at home at doing the business of, putatively, the res publica in this traditional mode, the diwan. We're all familiar with what a divan is, right? The thing you sit on when you put your feet up on an ottoman. Okay, it's a little cultural joke lost on some people. A divan is the couch that you would have consultation on. You'd sit down and talk to a tribal leader. You might talk to someone in a noble family, or to the king and consult. Here, of course, well, you can't get a couch that big, even a sectional at IKEA. So this is how they run it. But this is how you affect political discourse with the higher level authorities in certain areas in the Islamic world still, in one variant or another. And here we have Iran, with their constituent assembly of the people, which in many ways functions in its internal dynamics very much like a proper parliamentary system as we'd understand it in Europe. Except the question is, how do you get there? How do you get elected? Because you have the Council of the Guardians of the Revolution, who, sit above as kind of like the Chief Electoral Commission, determining eligibility just to run as a political candidate. It's much like the scrutiny that came from the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Soviet times in determining who actually gets to stand, and therefore what positions, what arguments, what discourse happens with the public, the general electorate. And here we have a happy little image from it. 3 years ago, there was a debate on a bill, the bill for protection of the family and its values. And just look at it. I mean, it's not unlike what we'd see in our own parliament in this country. You don't necessarily see people paying too much attention to what's going on. This is, of course, a result of that dynamic, which does have an impact on thinking of many conservative people in that particular society. And look down at the bottom. Who do you see down there? You see the 3 women. Look at that proportionally. What are they there for? Is this not perhaps an example of a kind of tokenism? What real voice do they have? How do they represent their putative constituency? Do some do that? Or do they necessarily have to go outside the system to do that? And again, it's a complicated matter in Iran because the particular notion of government in Iran since the late 1970s is governed by a specific doctrine called Theology, which was finally formulated and crystallized by Imam Khomeini. Okay, and it operates differently to other interpretations of the source of authority for governance in a more or less secular manner elsewhere in the Islamic world. This is the reason why you have, for example, the Council of Guardians of the Revolution, because this term vilayat de faqih refers to the government, the delegation of authority, which has ultimately a divine ordinance for it, down to the faqih, which in Arabic is faqih, which is a judge. In other words, the Islamic jurisprudence. The imams who have the requisite background in jurisprudence, obviously to interpret law, but also to interpret the validity and eligibility of persons to engage in the legislative process. And so that's very important when you're looking at authority in people's thinking and what they are working against or working in the interests of in the Islamic world. Much more nuanced than, we generally tend to think. Now, we jump in time and we take a look at other perceptions we have of Muslims in the Islamic world. We think about the golden age, the era of the efflorescence of a superior Islamic culture during the period of the Middle Ages, and the things that we associate closely with it. Architecture. Here you have Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, built, of course, on the ruins of the Second Herodian Temple. What do people understand about that? And the significance? Yes? 2 minutes? That's all? Oh, I got a really boogie. Okay, so we'll run you through a lot of this to say this is about people's perspectives and perception. And you see, you went through the glory. What I'm running through right now are images of slums. Slum before in Cairo, slum in Jeddah, slum in Mecca, the holy city, outside really lovely major tower developments going on. What does that say to you when you're thinking about a society of Islam? And then we go to other perceptions in the West and people's play on it. Right? Charlie Hebdo, one of the Yolan's posts. This is the frieze at the Supreme Court of the United States, which went up in the 1890s. And centrally there, this is a frieze which lists 18 important lawmakers in the world, is the Prophet Muhammad, with the book and the sword. Not that different from the scales and the sword in some measure as well. What does that say about changes in Western attitudes and understanding about Islam? Now, we get to, this is a medieval depiction of the Prophet Muhammad based on a book by Boccaccio about famous and illustrious men of history depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Doesn't look so bad to us, does it? Except he's got a pigeon on his shoulder, a dove, which is an indication in the iconography of Christianity in the Middle Ages of someone who is a false prophet and spouting false doctrine. Here's something we've seen on the internet. Interesting. I'm wondering about the source. I have no idea. Maybe it comes from a reformist-minded Muslim. Another one of the Yulan's Posten cartoons that caused such great offense. Now here's something. It might cause offense to those who fall into the tradition of Sunnah wherein you cannot depict physically the person of the Prophet Muhammad. But look at this image. What is necessarily so offensive if you position it historically and you have some understanding of the Qur'an and you've read, hadith, and you understand this man's place, in a cultural religious tradition arising out of the Hanifs, who were monotheist ascetics. What is it we see here? A man coming out of the desert or going into the desert looking serious? Bent on a mission? What is there in the context of reading Islam and its history to take offense from? Again, it's an interesting point about people's filters and understanding what informs their thinking. To my mind, when I looked through the Yolan's Post cartoon 6 years ago, I looked at this one and it just left me scratching my head saying, that's not actually bad at all. Okay, now, this is a postcard from Algeria in the 1920s or 30s, depicting an important scene from the Qur'an of the night raid in which the Quraysh in Mecca sought to kill the Prophet Muhammad, finally, get him out of the way, and he got a tip. He fled and left Ali and certain members of his family behind, to hold down the fort and delay the cops, so to speak. And the cops nevertheless, pursued them further, fleeing to a cave, with Abu Bakr, the mouth of the cave being protected by a spider's web. They went into the cave, the spider's web remained unbroken, and so the police, using classic 7th century forensic techniques, said, well, they can't be hiding in this cave because the spider's web is unbroken. But it's interesting, this card. Yes, it's written in French and Arabic. Is it necessarily, however, the product of French colonialists? Why would they bother making something like this? This is, in fact, I think, a devotional piece of Algerian Muslims who've adapted and evidently broken with Sunni norms, because that sure is Muhammad, and that's Abu Bakr. Now we go into the art I really like. Here's what we would normally see in any depiction, and it primarily occurs in Shia art, starting in the 12th century, but really of 13th, 14th, 15th century. This is the Prophet Muhammad at Hira. His face is obscured with a veil, but it's obviously the Prophet Muhammad. It's a holy personage because you can see that halo of flame. It's a motif that came from Buddhist art around him. Here we have the Prophet before the Kaaba, prostrate in worship at Mecca. Again, his face is veiled, therefore it's obscured. He cannot be said to be engaged in any kind of shirk, idolatrous activity, but it's Muhammad. The text tells you so. And we move on. Well, look, you've got Muhammad, you've got, I'm trying to remember, is that Ali? And then you have, I believe, that's supposed to be Fatima beside him. So it's really curious. Two members of his family with him, only one's got their face obscured. What's the meaning of that? Now you go to an earlier piece of Iranian art. This is the death of the Prophet Muhammad. His face is obscured because you have him being comforted by one of his mourning followers, who his body is turned in attitude, and the head you see there is not that of the Prophet Muhammad. It's the man leaning over him to give him succor and comfort in his last moments. And now we have ourselves moving to a case in which, curiously, the Prophet Muhammad's face is obscured, and there's an angel. The angel's face is depicted. That's really curious. Now we go to a late 7th century coin from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik. The guy in the center is the Prophet Muhammad. This is peculiar because in Sunnah you should not be portraying. Yeah, I'll wrap it up. There's a lot more to go. But these are points to think about. And look what it's based on. It's based on a drachma from probably about 10 to 20 years earlier of the Byzantine Emperor Constans II. So when you're looking, I was going to go through a lot of hadith and things, but to wrap it up, because we have Professor Asker to speak, you have to think very carefully, as Jim indicated, about context, historical context, current context. It's something you have to think about the institutions of transmission that come. How we receive it is, in large measure, just a measure of ourselves, and not necessarily of those who would be our interlocutors, whom we'd seek to engage on in discussing these matters. So that when we are looking at Islam, as I said, you've got to get amongst the weeds, play the snake. Certainly you can play the devil's advocate, but it's more complicated than that. Thank you.